Legend of Oz, Dorothy's Return. I've actually heard of this film for a while now, and I've never really thought about it much since. Back then, all I knew was that it was a sequel to the 1939 classic with an all-star cast like Dan Aykroyd, Kelsey Grammer, Jim Belushi, Patrick Stewart, Martin Short, just to name a few. What followed afterwards were just a few screenshots and a lot of delays. I always presumed it was just an independent animated feature, since it only showed at the Annecy International Animated Film Festival. But now that this is finally out in theaters for the whole world to see, will this be something as charming as the wonderful land of Oz, or is it better to just stay in Kansas? Let's find out. The story. Before I get into this, I just want to mention that this is based on one of the more recent books in the Oz series, Dorothy of Oz. However, this movie in particular is set directly after the first story, where Dorothy wakes up only to find Kansas in ruins because of the tornado. Which brings up one of the biggest issues with the story. There's barely any continuity between this and the first story. Technically, yes, there are a few basic things that it's aware of, like Dorothy killed the Wicked Witch of the West. But other than that, it tends to forget a lot of other important things. Take Kansas, for example. The film is trying to tell us that it's supposed to be set during somewhere around our time, since we see a lot of trucks and cars being used. Well, that's fine and all, but the first story is set during the early 1900s. See the problem here? But it's not just that. But there's also the factor of missing key characters and elements that this movie suddenly forgot that makes it feel much less of a Wizard of Oz sequel. It's pretty amazing how this movie not even once mentioned the iconic ruby slippers. Now, you can argue that this film is trying to be more its own adaptation of the Oz series rather than copying someone else's. I understand that very well. But here's the thing. From how it stands, it's not a sequel to its own version of The Wizard of Oz. That doesn't exist. It's a sequel to this one. It's trying to be two things at once when it's impossible to do. But that's not even the worst part. The worst is that there's not even continuity in its own story. There are moments that the movie would use a small joke only to bring it back as a serious situation. Like, it didn't seem that bad at first. Because of this, it's left with so many plot holes and leaves the audience to question the movie itself. I can see the elements of how it could make its own unique Oz follow-up, but with a story that's this confused of what it's trying to be, I'm not even sure if where they are is even Oz in the first place. The animation. This may seem like some random crap picked up by the Weinstein Company, but it actually isn't. This actually comes to us by Prana Animation Studios, the same people behind the Tinkerbell movies. And it kinda shows. You can tell that this shares the same quality as a direct-to-DVD film. With the character design and animation, it looks like it's trying to do that classical Mark Davis Disney style with a bit of a more cartoon flair to it, but it doesn't seem to mix well, nor does it translate very good onto computer. That and the textures on the characters really make the quality suffer. They don't look or feel like what they're supposed to be, and they don't reflect right onto the light. But then there's the background and the settings. Although it doesn't really feel like Oz itself, for what it is, it does look nice. Rather it be Candy Country, the China Kingdom, or in the Jester's Lair, it does have that Oz-like innocent Fantasyland feeling. That and the effects are often really nice to watch. When Dorothy would find herself in places like the cave with the fireflies, or when the Jester would pull something up with his spells, that's when the movie actually looks good and really enhances the fantasy element of the film. If there's one thing that I'd like to add that's actually an issue with the animation, it's that sometimes it can get a little freaky. I know it's weird to say that for an Oz movie, and I know some have gotten scared of the Wicked Witch in the classic film. But there are plenty of times when it gets unintentionally frightening in a way that's a bit out of place for the movie itself. Also, may I add that the Jester's marionettes are possibly the most disturbing thing I've seen in a recent animated film. Seriously, you will not sleep when you see Puppet Glinda. I won't say that the animation is terrible, but the movie does look more amateurish. The characters. One thing's for sure, these are not the same characters we've known to love. The only thing I could pretty much say about the recurring characters is that they've all been reduced to something that's just two-dimensional. Now I know that you could probably say the same about the original Wizard of Oz characters, but they did it in a way that's full of charm, emphasizing both who they are and what they need. Here, however, it's like they took off all the charm and likability. Dorothy is just the generic heroine, the Scarecrow is a genius, the Tin Man is an emotional basket case, and the Lion is a tough guy. I understand the changes they made to show what happened after Dorothy left Oz for the first time, but they've changed them to the point that we don't recognize them anymore. Not to mention that most of the time, Scarecrow, Tin Man, and Lion are just prisoners to the Jester, who have nothing to do until Dorothy comes to save them. The only exception in this case is Glinda the Good Witch, and that's because she's been turned into the stuff of nightmares. Seriously, beware of Puppet Glinda. As for the new characters, Dorothy's 3 new companions are no better. Not only do they have weak characteristics, but they also have no purpose to achieve other than to help Dorothy. Wiser just talks a lot, the China Princess is a brat turned into a love interest, and Marshall Mello is a man with authority who's in love with the princess. And then there's the Jester, who I will admit has set up an interesting backstory as the Wicked Witch's brother who has been cursed to always be the fool. But he's pretty much the Wicked Witch of the West who wants to take over Oz. The only reason why they didn't just use the witch is because she's dead. Although they are not hateable or intolerable, I bet the wizard himself would be embarrassed to see his more noteworthy people just washed down into something forgettable. Hey, speaking of which, where the fridge was the guy? The songs. Hey, remember how the songs on the original classic are so upbeat, timeless, and unforgettable? Yeah, that doesn't exist here. I'm a fan of musicals, and usually they would be the highlight of the film. Yet, I barely remember any of the songs or the musical numbers, mostly because they're not worth remembering. These are possibly some of the most generic and dull songs I've ever heard in an animated feature yet. They feel like they've just been added in at the last second because 1, the classic is also a musical, and 2, it's just filler whenever the characters have nothing to do. I don't think the titles are relevant because they could just be easily described as the home song, the love song, the comical situation song, the villain song, and the candy song. That's all you need to know about them. They don't even stand out well on their own. They could just be easily overshadowed by whatever songs on the radio or other movie songs that are way better than this. But the worst thing that they did to the songs is that most of them are modernized. Some of them have this pop twist to them, rather it be the overall tone or just the way the actors are singing in them, that gives the songs and even the movie an overall dated feeling. How can you screw up such a timeless story like the Oz series and just make it feel like just a product of its time? If you can't even get the songs right in your animated musicals, especially when it's something so fun to watch as The Land of Oz, then why are you even trying to begin with? I'll be honest with you guys. When I saw the trailer, or even its Rotten Tomatoes rating, which you guys made me aware, I didn't expect the movie to suck this much. Legend of Oz: Dorothy's Return is the embodiment of everything that the 1939 Wizard of Oz is not. Instead of a simple story that's easy to both follow and get into, it feels confusing and inconsistent. Instead of beautiful and revolutionary visuals, this has mediocre animation that's sometimes disturbing. Instead of charming and lovable characters, they're just forgettable with no development. And instead of timeless, legendary songs, they feel generic and dated. I highly recommend you just skip this film entirely and just stick with the original classic. Or, if you really need that fix of a Wizard of Oz sequel, then you should go check out the 1985 Disney film Return to Oz. Even if it's based more on the books than the 1939 movie, it is an amazing film with great characters and fantastic special effects. Technically, yeah, it's scarier, but at least they did it on purpose, and its execution is much better. As for this Wizard of Oz sequel, it only gets a big bucket of the AniMat's seal of garbage.
Never told you, but I meant to before I could begin. Even then, I loved you, even then.